We're here today to talk about trams and light rail in the context of the Thames Gateway Tramlink or Kennex scheme, whichever you prefer. So, first of all, a bit about me. I'm an expert. I've said that to many people. Trust me, I'm an expert. I've spent more than 50 years in the public transport business in various aspects of it. I've never run airlines or ferries, buses, trains, trams, etc. I've had my fingers in at one time or another. I've worked in both the public and the private sectors, and that's given me the massive advantage of realizing that I had to change my view, because I used to think that public transport was such an important thing, it cannot possibly be left to the private sector. Then, when I was involved in the private sector, and particularly in the way in which we transformed the bus system in London, it dawned on me that actually it's far too important to be left entirely to the public sector. You need a blend somehow of the two. Ideally, of course, you need a very well-organised, functioning authority that calls the shots, that raises the money, that facilitates the building, but quite possibly hands over the operation to a private sector organisation through a very tight set of well-managed contracts. That's what we did with buses in London, and they were at least 50% better than they were in the days when they were all red and run largely by the Transport and General Workers Union. So these things are important, and they have a great context in what we're coming to discuss today. So I'm not going to bore you with all the details there. I am a lifelong advocate of electric public transport, trams and trolley buses, both of which we should not have thrown away. Most people now realise that's a mistake. So two hats really I wear in this context: my own small business, which is gradually fading away because I was 74 last Monday, and as a vice president of the LRTA. The LRTA is a very interesting organisation. It started life in 1937. Its sole purpose, being London-based, was to fight London Transport's abolition of tramways. It failed, in fairness, as it was probably inevitably going to. But from the 1980s onwards, it was able, with a big Cheshire Cat smile, to say to everyone, "Told you so." You shouldn't have done that, because the realisation dawned that it was a mistake and that we desperately needed something like trams, like rail, in our major urban areas, hence Metrolink in Manchester, NET in Nottingham, etc., etc. What can trams do? This is a question that's often posed, and it's very important that we understand the key drivers. These are some figures from across Europe. Forget that we're no longer part of the EU. This is Europe as a continent, including the islands of the United Kingdom. Urban public transport provides 13 million jobs. That's a hell of a lot of people involved in something that is very, very important to everyday life. Investment in public transport creates between a half and double the number of new jobs as investment in roads. Why don't we understand that? Why do we still have mostly UK governments, mostly of both colours, absolutely determined to build more roads? What does it achieve apart from more congestion? Every euro invested in public transport, according to a German study, knocks 5 to 5.30 euros of added economic value. Isn't that significant? Shouldn't we be doing more of it? In Switzerland, they calculate that each job created in the public transport sector creates 3.3 additional jobs in the regional economy. And these are very important aspects, because it's regional economies that count so much more than national ones. New tramways create unique opportunities to make cities more sustainable, much pleasanter places to live in. Really interesting. Go and ride on trams where they exist in the UK. Talk to people. Ask them what they used to do before there was a tram. Anything up to half of them used to drive. They don't anymore. They've still got a car, of course, but they use the tram, because the tram is a much, much more attractive conveyance than a bus would be. Enhanced mobility and reduced social inclusion. Trust me, I'm an expert. This form of transport is the most accessible you can achieve. We ran articulated buses in London because it made huge sense to save pots and pots of money, one driver to 150 people instead of one driver to 80 or 85 people. That's why you do it. But getting 18 metres a bus lined up with the curbs so that all three doorways are within 25 millimetres of the pavement, almost impossible. Really, really good drivers tried very, very hard. Most of them, bloody excellent results. But it is physically impossible. The advantage of a railed vehicle like a tram is that it doesn't matter how long it is, how many sets of doors it's got, if you've designed it correctly, every single one of those doorways is going to be level and within 25 to 30 mil. Absolute total accessibility. No ifs, no buts. Above all, and this is the key thing that we need to understand much, much better in the UK, fixed track public transport creates confidence. You can have the fanciest bus in the world, but it's still a set of wheels that can be driven in a different direction, round the block, onto another route. Here today, gone tomorrow. Nobody but a fool is going to be investing millions, and it is millions, in laying tracks for some sort of perfect public transport system like a tramway and take it away again in a few days, months, or even years' time. So these things do matter to the people who are likely to bring inward investment to urban and regional economies. 20th century problem, it's well known, of course. We gave up the most sensible form of urban public transport known to man. We've always followed the American way. Henry Ford said everyone should have a motor car. We believed it, and everyone had a motor car by 1970 something. Has it helped? No, not at all. Interestingly, several, not all, but several other major European countries did things differently. And I find it fascinating that if you look at Germany, which today has 55 tramway systems, the vast bulk of those were very severely damaged in the Second World War, largely by the Americans, because their bomb aim wasn't quite as good as the RAF's. But all of those were rebuilt, and very often they were rebuilt by British-controlled administrations. Because what the army discovered, bless them, in cities like Hanover was that, okay, the thing's a bit knackered, half the cars have been destroyed, the other half caught fire, but the tracks are there, rudimentary though they were, and they could run so-called Trümmerbahnen. So you had rubble trains running on the tram tracks, which later you rebuilt as the key backbone to public transport in German cities. We didn't do any of that. So a lot of these places retained and modernized. They went for, heaven forbid, articulated cars to do the same business of saving money. But there was an interesting example in that France was very much more like us. They threw them away, apart from three places where, for strategic reasons I won't bore you with, they were retained. But in the 1980s, the equivalent of the Department of Transport in France, can you imagine this? Our Department of Transport ringing up city mayors and saying, you've got a problem, Francois, what are you going to do about it? Your problem is congestion, look at it. There are too many cars, there are queues for car parks, the environment is being polluted, this is awful. We want you to consider carefully alternatives. For example, bringing back the tram. And a lot of mayors laughed and said, ha, until the minister made it very clear that this meant there would be a check for somebody who was going to pioneer this. And it ended up being the city of Nantes. And the rest, as they say, is history. 1985, that network began. It was the first of this new dawn of the tramway renaissance in France. Today, that city boasts 3 lines. It's planning a 4th one, and even looking seriously at a 5th one. It's invested in a regional tram train combination alongside that new network. And that's not uncommon all across France. This is the kind of thing that they got. Modern, sleek, absolute priority over other traffic, and exactly what people would be prepared to use. Interestingly, the second French city to go back to the tram was Grinnell in the south, a beautiful place right in the foothills of the Alps. And they were the pioneers of low floor. But good old Grinnell pioneered low floor. They were very nervous about how this might actually work. So they invested in these small pallets in the doorways. I'm sorry, you haven't got that picture yet. Because they were fearful that there might be too big a gap or step. In fact, there wasn't. So very quickly, because these were an expensive encumbrance, they were replaced by the simplicity of ensuring that you've got 25, 30 maximum millimetre horizontal, plus or minus 20 on the vertical, which is perfectly achievable with good infrastructure, properly maintained. The way in which this has worked in France is that urban areas, cities and towns are obliged to create urban mobility plans. They have to say how they're going to tackle this phenomenon of congestion, over-dependence on the motor car. And they have to put this forward to local people. They have to consult business. And through a process called DUP, the Déclaration d'Utilité Publique, they can then get state money, local money, and they can set up a very important local funding means called the Versement Transport. Crudely, this is a payroll tax. It's effectively saying, in this, take Nantes, for example, in the commune around the city of Nantes, where the tram was going to be a big influence, money is collected from business, but it is ring-fenced to be spent on projects like tramways or so-called TCSP, in some cases busways, in one case even a monorail. So this was a very, very important new way of achieving local funding to be decided upon and spent locally. Critically, and you can imagine, most businesses were fuming and saying, this is ridiculous, I don't want to, why do I want a tramway? But gradually they realised the benefits a tramway brought them as a business. I can name you dozens of businesses across French cities who have saved packs and packs and packs of money because they no longer need car parks. People go to work in their factories, their offices, their industrial establishments, whatever it may be, by tram. They use public transport where they wouldn't have dreamt of doing it before. So you don't need to invest in car parks. The mayor is a very, very important figure in all this. We have a kind of ambivalence about mayors, don't we? We had one in Bristol, and the local people in Bristol have decided they don't want one anymore because there's a West of England combined authority mayor who has very little authority and certainly no money. So, you know, it's very simple, isn't it? You need a figurehead, you need a leader. God help us, Boris was one. You know, be fair to the guy. Everybody knew him. He was the mayor. You were in no doubt. Yeah? So mayors are very important to this process because they are taking the lead and they're acting as this bridge between the state that is going to give them some money and the local communities, the people they represent, and of course business. Critically, business. You get them on side and you're well away. A lot of this in France has been undertaken, you could go back to the days of Mitterrand, when the French fell in love with les grands projets. Les grands projets, you have a big, big project, you know, you throw everything into it. So most of the 29 places in France where there's a modern tramway, the principle adopted has been to remodel the city at the same time. The costs of doing so are not all allocated to the tramway. You can bet your life they would be in the UK, and to some extent they have been in some of the systems that we've developed. But it is their choice to do that. I think they're right, because I think if you're going to transform the way in which people travel and the way in which they live in urban areas, it's very, very useful to take this grand projet approach. Critically, what it has done is to rejuvenate the bus. There isn't a place on the planet where the only form of public transport is a tram. Trams depend on buses, but buses are a secondary facility. They feed tramways in all the right ways. They're not as environmentally friendly, etc., but you need buses. If you can substantially upgrade the buses, as and when you introduce the tramway, you're on a winner, because you will increase bus use. And that's exactly what happened. This is Nantes, where they invested in a lot of natural gas-powered buses alongside the development of the tramway, and that's resulted in a very, very big increase in public transport use. Obviously the tram being new, but bus use has increased as well because of the way in which this grand projet approach has been taken. Critically, new infrastructure can allow development of new areas. I live in northeast Hampshire, and in northeast Hampshire there's a lot of former military land which is being redeveloped for absolutely desperately needed housing. But it's a disaster. It's an absolute disaster because these places are remote from existing public transport, and in our deregulated privatised system it's very unlikely that Stagecoach, as our local operator, is going to be willing to run buses 24/7 to a new housing area to ensure that people don't get and use cars. But that is what you have to do. We are now in a serious climate emergency. There are a few deniers around. There are a few Rees-Moggs who want fracking and more fossil fuel extraction, but they are dinosaurs. The reality is, this climate emergency is starting to slap us round the face. We're realising excess temperatures, flooding, all kinds of problems are arising. The quicker we realise that a big contributor to that is the way in which we live in urban areas, the better. So we need housing that can genuinely be said to be car interdependent. All our housing built in the last 50 years in the UK has resulted in more car dependence. Virtually all the new housing built in the Netherlands has reduced car dependence. If you go to Carnisselanden to the south of Rotterdam, Nootdorp to the southeast of The Hague, Osdorp and Nieuw-Sloten to the west of Amsterdam, you will see what I mean. These have been planned developments where the first thing they've done is lay a tram line before any houses are built. And the second thing they've done is run a very, very frequent, every 4 or 5 minutes tram service for nobody for 5 years while the housing is developed. And wow, when people move into the houses, click, open the door, there's a tram outside every 4 minutes. Why do I need a car? So you don't get one. That's what we have to do. And you can make it attractive, low, mid-rise, whatever. The other great thing about a tramway is that it is much, much, much less controversial for politicians to say to the people, you're not going to be able to drive your car through the city centre anymore because we're going to make it a busway. What? Well, a bus is just a big car. I'm not having that. People will resist that type of thinking. Whereas if you say we're going to introduce a tramway, it'll make all the difference. This again is Grinnell. See the way in which public transport is dominating. You can build a metro system, but it's not helpful. You've got to get 20 metres below the ground to go 1.2 kilometres, come 20 metres up again. You know, why would you do that? Even in big cities, we don't need to do that. I was vehemently against Crossrail stroke the Elizabeth line. For the amount, that final bill is going to be about £3.9 billion for a piece of railway that connects 2 mainline stations with only 3 stops in between. We could have connected those 2 mainline stations with a very, very good quality tramway, solving the Oxford Street problem that's bedeviled Londoners for centuries, for much, much less. In fact, we could have built 9 or 10 modern tramways for the cost of Crossrail. And look at it now. Crossrail was dependent on a very large movement of peak hour workers in sectors like banking, who are all now working from home on Teams and Zoom. So we've probably blown most of that 3.9 billion. It should have been a very set of high quality tramways to replace the busiest bus routes, which is why we went articulated, because the next step would have been to change those to tram. The other great thing about these grand projet approaches is that you can do, as Madame Catherine Trautmann, the mayor of Strasbourg, did, is create this image of a wonderful interchange in the centre of the city. It's completely impractical as a shelter, of course. The wind still gets in, the rain can be horizontal, but boy, it looks the part. And I can show you about 27 UK public transport plans from different regions of the country that have this picture in it, because that's what they want, however impractical it may be. The other great thing, of course, that tramway developers have learned is that you can have a green strip, the green wave. You know, this is environmentally friendly. And actually the track people like grass, because it's much kinder to the roadbed, as it were, the rails last longer, etc., etc. So this really looks the part, you know, green strip, tram rails, trees either side. Why not? Insertion into the existing built environment is a challenge, there's no doubt about that. Ifs, no buts, not just on Sundays, not in the evenings only, all the time, 24/7, you're going to say no cars, cyclists, pedestrians, trams in our main city streets. Then you're really getting somewhere towards the environment emergency. Interchange, of course, self-evidently, you're not going to have tram lines absolutely everywhere, and as I mentioned earlier, the bus is a very important feeder to tramways, but you must make the interchange simple. It's no earthly good if the bus arrives just as the back end of the tram is disappearing. This is another example from Strasbourg, where you have buses on the left side, trams on the right side, cross-platform, undercover, no real difficulty. The Swiss would do this with time transfers, even though it's probably every 6 minutes, all through the day. There'll be time transfers, you're guaranteed not to wait. In fact, I used to say to British public transport doubters, follow the average Swiss to work in a city like Zurich, and as they walk into their office doorway, just tap them on the shoulder and say, excuse me, old chap, can't help noticing, your journey from home, you walked a bit, you used a bus, then a tram, then another bus, then another tram, and finally you'll come into office. But all these changes, and they'll say, what changes? What changes? Because they work. Clearly you cannot have everything to everywhere. That's never going to work. But you need to get interchange properly sorted. The other great thing is that in historic areas, another part of Strasbourg, these trams look as though they've been there for hundreds of years. It's not something that stands out like a sore thumb and everybody goes, oh my God, that's ghastly, take it away. There may or may not, I can't remember, there may or may not have been the first generation of trams until 1960 something in that same street. Doesn't matter. These were only there from 1994, but it looks as though they were there in 1894. It's a natural combination, fixed track public transport like a tram. Of course, there are pitfalls. You need to be careful about some of the things that may be advocated. In Bordeaux, the mayor, Alain Juppé, former prime minister, he knew how to unlock the money from central government, and he was given something like 3.2 billion to build 3 lines, all in one go. And because he had this fetish about overhead wires, he insisted on having an alternative system. This rail between the tracks, as it were, is actually providing power. It's called APS, Alimentation par Sol. Be careful, it's a proprietary system of Alstom, who build the trams. So you're really stuck with having trams from Alstom because it's their system these are running on. It's about 3 times more expensive in capital costs than simple overhead wires, and it's something like 8 times the cost in maintenance. Imagine, when it rains or there's ice, this is a problem. Water and electricity have never been known to mix terribly well. And it was a massive problem for Juppé. When the system started, they had one of the hardest, wettest winters on record, and these things were failing all over the place. Be very, very careful about what you do. And the amazing thing is, this is one of the terminals just off the centre in Bordeaux called Quinconce, and there you have this beautiful tree-lined avenue. You wouldn't notice the overhead wires if they were painted yellow with pink stripes. So why go to all this extra expense? Here in Orléans, a city slightly further away in northwest France, I challenge anyone to tell me where the overhead wires are. There are no big ugly poles as there are in Croydon, Manchester, Birmingham, because all of our light rail in the 1990s onwards has been developed by consultants who have no experience of modern tramways. They understand heavy rail. So the overhead in the centre of Croydon, you could run a French TGV through at 186 miles an hour and people weren't in the way. It's crazy. It's crazy. Most of the wire actually here is strung from the buildings. And that's a consent that has to be given. Political bravery is the thing that we have to understand left, right and centre. Another example from Bordeaux. This is Mériadeck, one of the main roads to the west of the city centre. This was a 4-lane, totally congested highway. And the mayor decided 2 of those lanes were going to be taken away and dedicated to the tramway. So you have 2 tram tracks and you still have 2 traffic lanes, which are congested all day long. And the message that sends out, the trams go by all the time with no interruption, no delays, but if you're sitting in a car, you're a fool. You're a fool, aren't you? Why aren't you on the tram? So in 34 years, the French have done it right. I think it's the best example in Europe, if not the world, of how you go about these things. We have struggled to build less than a quarter of what they've done at something like double the cost. And often the gestation period is 20 years, not 3 or 4. So grow up, Britain. One of the great end products of all this, not so long ago I was in Nice, and I thought, I'll go and buy a postcard. I don't know why I had this thing, I'll buy a postcard, send it to somebody, and I couldn't find anywhere that had a postcard of Nice without a tram on it. Every bloody way you went, every single postcard had a tram on it. Why? Because it's a great thing for our city. Notice if you watch the BBC or ITV News, whenever there's a story from Sheffield, you see a tram. Manchester, tram. Nottingham, tram. Edinburgh, tram. Yeah? This is something that we need to understand. There is a kind of magic about trams that buses will never have. So go forth and do it. Lessons for the UK, well, they're all pretty obvious, aren't they? We need autonomy at a local level. We do need people like mayors to drive these things forward. We need to place an obligation on cities and towns to create plans. We've never done that. We've never done that. We have these ridiculous competitions where some minister or other announces a new fund, the Saving Towns Fund. I'm saving towns. Come and bid. Yeah. You're all in competition, large and small. There's this massive race to get something out of the government, and then in the end the government says, actually, we've changed our minds, we haven't got any money at all anyway. Goodbye. Grow up. We've got to understand the importance of proper funding streams, ideally collected locally, like the Versement Transport. Although in the beginning you may have total opposition from local business, at the end you'll have 100% support. In fact, you'll have 150% support. They love it because they're beginning to see ways in which they are growing because the mayor's invested in a tramway. So total integration of tram and bus networks is a very, very important lesson. We are just coming out of the British era of a deregulated, privatised bus system. It hasn't really worked. I was a critic of it at the time, but I remember being told by Nicholas Ridley, the then Transport Minister, in answer to the question, where was the evidence that a deregulated system was the right way to go, he answered, young man, I was quite proud of that, young man, when one is blazing a trail, one is scarcely concerned with the evidence. There was no evidence. It has, in principle, been a failure. That's not to say we have no buses. I still have a bus every 15 minutes, virtually outside my house, but it goes down to every 2 hours, 10 minutes on a Sunday, and the last one's about 8 o'clock in the evening. That's not a real public transport service. I can't depend on that. I can't make connections with the trains, so I'm going to have a car, even though I've got a bus every 15 minutes, roughly 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. That's what we've ended up with. That era, as I say, is changing, and we're beginning to see the emergence of public control again in cities like Manchester. I hope Andy Burnham will learn sincerely from what we did in London, which is harness the private sector but tell them what to do, otherwise they'll make mistakes. So we need to be a lot more European and less American. Here are the vital things we need to do post-COVID, and that COVID's taught us a whole load of lessons, hasn't it? Absolutely. So traffic congestion continues to be the biggest single evil in urban areas. Various experts have tried to tot up the cost of it, and the figures may or may not be all over the place, but it is something we've got to get rid of. When I was 11, I went on a school exchange visit to a very nice family in Friesland, northern Netherlands. And the treat, these were midweek to midweek stays, the treat while the English boy was staying was the whole family to go to Amsterdam, not in the very large family car that was outside, but by train. And when we got to Amsterdam, we did a lot of walking, but we used the trams a lot. And these 11-year-old eyes put something in my brain, and it goes like this. Why the ... haven't they got cars? Why can't I see congestion in Amsterdam? Why isn't there a big queue of people trying to get into a car park like there is at home? And of course it's because they did the sensible thing and kept the trams. A year later, age 12, I went to an equally nice family in the northwest corner of Germany here. And the treat while the English boy was staying was to go to the city of Bremen, also full of trams. Also, we went by train, even though there was a big family car we could all have got into. These are kind of life lessons, well learned. So we don't have to have congestion, I think is the point, but we seem to have revelled in it. We got a massive problem with air quality. Almost every city in the UK is in breach of EU limits, and they still apply at the moment, even though we've left the bloc. London manages to exceed its annual target every year by mid-January. Shocking, isn't it? It's shocking. Yeah. And we've now had, actually on a death certificate, the case that a girl aged 9 was probably killed by excess pollution from the South Circular Road. So we're actually killing people. The rise in asthma among sub-10-year-olds is among the highest in the world in UK cities. We've got far, far too much pollution. And it's not just the smoky exhaust that you can see, but it's the PM10s and the 2.5s, the Oslo Effect. My friend Jim will lecture you for a month and a quarter on the Oslo Effect. This was from a study in the university in that city that showed actually the most dangerous pollutants are the ones that come from the interaction of tyres, road surfaces, dust from brake lining wear, and so on and so forth. And hey presto, we now have a situation where UK government is very proud to tell you that of course we will meet all our targets because we're transforming to an electric car economy. I've got an electric car. In fact, I've got my second electric car. I had a 4-year-old BMW i3 and I've just turned it in for another BMW i3, which I'll probably keep for 4 years on lease while they make up their minds what the next model is. But, converting the UK's 33.8 million cars from diesel or petrol to battery, because that's what it is, isn't going to solve congestion. In fact, I predict it's going to make it worse, because the average Joe getting into their battery-powered car is going to say, hey, you know, I'm not polluting the environment anymore. I'll go to the supermarket 3 times a week instead of once. I'll visit Auntie Lil, even though she doesn't want to see us, 4 times a month instead of 1. You know, so the danger is we will actually have 33 or more million electric cars, but congestion will get worse. What's that achieved? It's madness. Rapid electrification, however, of urban public transport is something to do and will produce huge benefits. Generation Z. I spend quite a lot of time talking to young people. And it's really, 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 really interesting that the average Joe in Generation Z doesn't want a car because they've got one of these. And if this lifestyle instrument gives them everything they want and tells them when the next bus is coming or the tram or whatever, in a really, really good and helpful way, they will eventually not have cars. And in fact, I'm willing to bet, after I'm pushing up the daisies, let's say in 50 years' time, there'll be conversations between grandparents and grandchildren. And the grandchildren will be saying, did you really have cars? That was bonkers. You know, what did you want them for? It's coming. It's coming. So this group of people is much more tuned in to the environment and concerns for the environment. And it does understand the need for higher density housing and so on. And that's not awful living, is it? For God's sake, it's just different. The old idea that you have a nice little pocket of garden and a 2x2 semi, etc., is gone. You know. So they're willing to make sacrifices that we haven't. And sacrifices will have to be made. Right, last but not least, quick comparison. A tale of 2 cities. Freiburg in Breisgau, quite near the Swiss border in southern Germany, is a city of 220,000 souls. York, you all know York, is a similar population. Look at the difference. Public transport, 31% journeys in Freiburg, 8. And falling in York. In Freiburg it's rising, and in 2 years' time it'll be well over 40, if not 45%. Car use, less than half. It can be done. How can we afford a tram system? Well, how can we not? How can we not? The bitterness of poor quality is rarely exceeded by the sweetness of low price. I wish I could claim that as an original Braddock, but it's not. But it is, think about it, very, very true. Marry in haste, repent at leisure. There were 2 cities in France, Caen and Nancy, that invested in an alternative, rubber-tired tram. Everybody said to them, you're bonkers, this won't work. And it didn't. Marry in haste, repent at leisure. Caen has replaced its rubber-tired trams with a conventional steel rail. Nancy says it hasn't got enough money, so it's going back to trolleybuses, which it had before the advent of their rubber-tired tram, which is really a trolleybus anyway. So be very careful of these things that appear to be saving money. Buses are cheaper. I mean, HM Treasury has always been a massive barrier to investment in trams in the UK because they will always say, oh, why don't you have a bus? It's much cheaper. Huh? Okay, I can go out and buy a decent modern. In fact, we were buying articulated buses for London, the most decent, most modern seen in the UK thus far, for about 280k. And the equivalent, but longer, tram would probably have been 10 times that. But it doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? Because over the whole life of the asset, you are saving millions in having the higher capacity vehicle, providing a more satisfactory service, attracting more people out of their cars, etc., etc. We have to understand whole life costs. And in any public transport enterprise, trust me, I've run lots of them, the biggest single cost is going to be drivers. Yeah? If you've got 8,500 buses, as we had in London at the last count, that's a hell of a lot of drivers. You can only reduce that number and the cost, which is about 70% of your total running costs are drivers. You can only reduce that if you have bigger vehicles. QED. Climate crisis. What climate crisis? Here we are with I think we've still got government. This morning it was doubtful. Here we are. They're still saying they're going to spend 27.5 billion on new roads. They promised, but they largely ratted on the promise, to invest 3 billion in buses. They've made no promise about light rail. Not sure they really understand it. They're still stuck with the mentality that you need a bus. A bus is cheaper. Have a bus. Yeah, a bus. Go. Get another bus. Right. So, final example. Besançon, small town in eastern France, in the Franche-Comté region. Nice little town. Mayor was very, very keen to have a tram. All his advisors, all the studies said you can't do this. Place isn't big enough. Not enough people getting in. Blah blah blah. You know, you can't do it. You can't do it. You can't do it. But he was determined, and he drove through a set of plans that were different to anywhere else in France. Number one, they weren't doing this façade à façade, grand projet approach, renewing every street. They were just going to lay a tramway. Number two, they went for very small, by French standards, trams, only 19.5 metres long, a bit bigger than a bus. But they managed it, they achieved it, and they got the lowest construction cost, around 16 million euros a kilometre, which was pretty much record beating for modern France. And they didn't have the kind of gin palace depot that some of the others have had, not being critical, but some of them are very, very grand. This was basically an open yard with a covered maintenance area, and it works. But the really, really good news about Besançon is that having done this, they're now at the point where they're having to lengthen their trams because the number of passengers exceeds supply on a daily basis. So they're going to put more money, which has been available through the standard grant system and reintroducing the Versement Transport, into lengthening the trams, lengthening the stops, providing more frequent services, and in a few years' time building a second, well, it's a third line because effectively it's 2 lines with branches at the moment. So the success criteria is there if you're brave in the first place. Thames Gateway. I like this project. I think it's a very exciting proposition. What I like about it is it is forcing a regional approach, not a town or a city or a country or a county, but a regional approach. And this is very, very refreshing, because if we can crack some of our transport problems at a regional level, we're well on the way to matching up to the climate crisis. Wavestroke Kennex is looking at for urban renewal of one kind or another. I know the Thurrock area very well. I used to be at London Country Bus Services and we ran the buses there. It's a dreadful place, or it was. It's probably improved a bit, but think how much it could be transformed by having a modern tram in its streets. It has the ability to remove millions of local car trips. I was staggered, I can't remember the figure, Gordon, but I'm sure you're going to quote it. The number of local journeys by car across the QE2 bridge or through the original Dartford Tunnel is staggering. You know, you've got people going out to buy a loaf of bread, crossing the bridge, going back through the tunnel. It's madness. It's complete madness. That needs to be replaced by good quality public transport. This scheme, above many others, would achieve a massive improvement in air quality, and it has the potential to open up connectivity both with the Elizabeth line at Abbey Wood. There's bonkers talk about, oh, why don't we extend the Elizabeth line to Dover, to Calais? Don't waste your money. Build a tramway to connect to Abbey Wood. Don't take it any further. We've wasted enough money on heavy rail. Fast Track, the relatively good quality BRT system in and around Dartford, Gravesend, Ebbsfleet. Poor old Ebbsfleet. When will it ever get a train to Paris again? Who knows? That has the potential to be part of this. You could, I'm assuming it's been built as the kind of busway that could be upgraded to light rail, and maybe it should be, but certainly to get connectivity with those other modes is very, very important. And it has the potential, as mentioned previously, for car-free housing development. Sooner or later, we've got to grasp that nettle and say, sorry, if you're going to live in this nice new area, you won't be able to have a car. And above all, it's an attractor for inward investment. I can't think of a better way across the Kennex region, let me call it that, to reassure developers that their money won't be wasted if they come along and invest in this, that and the other, because this spine of a really high quality public transport network is going to be there. I put at the bottom in small type, remember, an expensive tramway is more affordable than not having one. We are surely now at the point, looking forward, where we can see in our urban areas that we've got massive problems vis-à-vis the climate emergency. So we're going to have to do these things. Why don't we get on and do them now before it's too late? Remember too that trams are actually best at removing cars. Thank you.